Welcome to Obscured History. Tonight we journey into a forgotten chapter of the medieval world, the lost Cupola of Saint-Denis, a vanished dome that could have reshaped European architecture. Imagine walking into a church in 12th century France, gazing upward, and seeing something no one had dared before, a massive dome in stone, glowing with colored light. This was the hidden centerpiece of Gothic innovation, an experiment so bold that it almost vanished from memory. How was it built? Why did it disappear? And what secrets did it leave behind in the story of architecture? Just north of Paris stands Saint-Denis, often called the birthplace of Gothic architecture, but hidden in its history is a bold, forgotten experiment, an immense dome, unlike anything Europe had ever seen. In the 12th century, Abbot Suger dreamed of a church that would draw heaven closer to earth. At its heart, he envisioned a soaring crown of light, a vast stone dome, centuries ahead of its time. The dome rose above the basilica briefly. Then it vanished. Some say it collapsed. Others believe it was deliberately removed. What truly happened? The lost dome of Saint-Denis remains one of medieval architecture's greatest mysteries, still puzzling historians and architects to this day. What was the lost dome of Saint-Denis? Why did Abbot Suger, the visionary behind the basilica, insist on building it? And how might Europe's cathedrals look different today if it had survived? To find answers, we step into 12th century France, an age of ambition, innovation, and faith. Saint-Denis near Paris was no ordinary church. It was the royal necropolis, the resting place of kings, and the birthplace of Gothic architecture. Here Abbot Suger dreamed of a church filled with light and harmony. He believed light itself was a path to the divine, and at its heart, he envisioned a dome to symbolize heaven rising above the altar. But unlike the soaring Gothic spires that followed, this massive dome was unstable and doomed to fail. Its brief life left behind one of medieval architecture's most fascinating mysteries. Abbot Suger was no ordinary church leader. He was a statesman, an advisor to kings, and above all, a dreamer of light. For him, architecture was theology, buildings were sermons, and light was the presence of God. In an age when most cathedrals favored flat vaults and simple towers, Suger dared to raise a dome, an echo of Byzantium, a whisper of Rome reimagined for France, a bold fusion of tradition and innovation. At Saint-Denis, this vision briefly became reality. A massive dome crowned the basilica, challenging the limits of medieval engineering. But the stone cracked, shifted, and vanished from memory. What collapsed at Saint-Denis was not just a dome, but an idea. In its place, Gothic builders embraced a new path, the ribbed vault. Before Abbot Suger, churches were heavy, dark, and Romanesque, massive walls, narrow windows, and dim interiors. But at Saint-Denis, he envisioned something revolutionary: ribbed vaults, pointed arches, radiant stained glass. And at the very center, a daring dome, the cupola that would crown his vision. This dome was more than architecture. It symbolized heaven itself, eternity, divine authority, and the sacred bond between God and kingdom. To raise a dome above Saint-Denis was to declare that France stood under heaven's crown. For a brief moment, this vision became reality. A massive stone dome rose over the basilica, centuries ahead of its time, an audacious fusion of faith, art, and engineering. But imagine if it had survived. Europe's cathedrals, from Notre Dame to Chartres, might have risen with domes instead of spires. The entire skyline of medieval France, Italy, and beyond could have looked profoundly different.
Abbot Suger drew inspiration from Byzantium and Rome, where domes symbolized the heavens. But he sought something new, to merge that celestial vision with the rising Gothic style. For Suger, a dome would not only embody heaven, it would anchor the entire church in cosmic meaning.
Stone by stone, masons lifted arches skyward. Timber scaffolds groaned beneath the weight. And slowly, the Dome of Saint-Denis began to rise, an unprecedented sight in northern Europe. But this bold structure would not endure. The stone shifted, the weight proved unstable, and the vision that once crowned the basilica was lost to time. Yet behind it stood a man of extraordinary vision. Abbot Suger was not only a churchman but a politician, philosopher, and patron of art. At Saint-Denis, he fused Romanesque tradition with daring innovation, creating something Europe had never seen before. Though no images survive, scholars believe the lost Cupola of Saint-Denis was a vast circular dome above the crossing, supported by innovative ribbed vaults. Imagine standing beneath it, colored glass flooding the interior, the dome shimmering like a gateway to the divine. But this bold experiment strained under its own ambition. Cracks appeared, stones shifted. Before long, the dome was dismantled, a vision erased before it could define an era. The basilica itself was no ordinary church. Built to house the relics of Saint-Denis, the patron saint of France, it became the royal necropolis where kings were crowned and buried. At the very heart of this sacred space, Abbot Suger placed his greatest experiment. The Lost Dome, an audacious fusion of faith, power, and innovation that still haunts the story of Gothic architecture. It was a risky vision. Northern France was not Rome. The climate, the stone, and the engineering traditions were different. Gothic builders excelled at pointed arches and soaring vertical lines, but domes demanded an entirely different skill set. Unlike Notre Dame or Chartres, the Dome of Saint-Denis left behind no grand images, no detailed drawings, no surviving plans, only fragments and chronicles, scattered descriptions, and faint traces in the masonry, a story half erased by time. Here lay the great challenge. Medieval builders understood arches and ribbed vaults, but not the immense calculations required for domes. The Romans had mastered it with the Pantheon, but those secrets had been lost for centuries. At Saint-Denis, Suger's masons struggled to balance massive forces of stone and gravity. The result was daring, fragile, and ultimately doomed. Yet it remains one of the boldest architectural experiments of the Middle Ages. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear in the Great Dome of Saint-Denis. The structure was breathtaking but unstable. Unlike Byzantine domes built of lighter brick, Suger's masons relied on heavy French stone, and the base strained against the walls. The sheer weight pushed outward, threatening collapse. Even with supports and early buttresses, the experiment could not hold. Stones shifted, fractures spread, and the dream of a heavenly crown began to crumble. When the dome was finally abandoned, architects turned to something new. Instead of circular perfection, they embraced pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, structures that carried weight upward instead of outward. From this failure, Gothic architecture was truly born. The lost Dome of Saint-Denis vanished, but in its place rose a revolutionary style of height, light, and vertical power that would transform Europe's cathedrals forever. By the early 13th century, the Great Dome of Saint-Denis was gone. Some chronicles claim it collapsed under its own weight. Others suggest it was dismantled for safety. Whatever the truth, the cupola vanished, leaving behind only silence and questions. Had it endured, Europe's cathedrals might have resembled the domed basilicas of Byzantium. But instead, Gothic builders sought another path, higher, sharper, and lighter, reaching toward heaven in new ways. From this failure emerged something revolutionary: the ribbed vault. By crossing slender arches, masons learned to channel weight more efficiently, creating structures stronger and more flexible than domes. The ribbed vault was not just safer, it was more beautiful. It allowed taller walls, vast stained glass windows, and an architecture of light that redefined Europe's cathedrals for centuries to come. What endured at Saint-Denis was the rest of Abbot Suger's vision: ribbed vaults, pointed arches, and radiant stained glass. These elements flourished and spread across Europe, while the dome, the boldest experiment, vanished into obscurity. Suger dreamed of light pouring into stone. He called it the lux nova, the new light. Through stained glass and precise geometry, he sought to make heaven itself descend into the church. The dome was only one piece of that larger dream. Though it failed, it pushed builders to reimagine architecture, not with circular crowns, but with spires, ribbed vaults, and soaring windows of light. From that failure, Gothic architecture was born. The luminous walls of Chartres, the towers of Notre Dame, the great cathedrals of Europe, all trace their origins to the lost dome of Saint-Denis. Sometimes, history advances through failure. Consider Notre Dame of Paris, built only decades after Saint-Denis. It carried forward Suger's dream of radiant light, but instead of a dome, its builders embraced ribbed vaults and flying buttresses. This was the turning point. The loss of the cupola forced Gothic architects to double down on verticality: soaring spires, intricate buttresses, and vast stained glass windows. In abandoning the dome, Gothic became a style distinct from Byzantium and Islam. In Byzantium, domes proclaimed imperial power. In Islam, domes crowned mosques with celestial harmony. But in France, a dome might have carried a different meaning: the unity of church and crown beneath heaven's vault. Instead, the Gothic imagination took another path, shaping cathedrals that pierced the sky and filled with light, transforming Europe's skyline for centuries to come. Think of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople or the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, domes that crowned worship with heaven itself. At Saint-Denis, Abbot Suger dreamed of the same: a canopy of light rising above France's spiritual heart. But France was not Rome or Byzantium. Builders lacked the traditions of the Pantheon or Hagia Sophia. With heavy French stone and unfamiliar techniques, the dome strained, cracked, and finally failed. Its collapse was inevitable. Today, the Dome of Saint-Denis is almost forgotten. Tourists wander the basilica, unaware that above them once rose a daring experiment in stone and faith. Historians search scattered traces, asking, was it majestic or awkward? A lost masterpiece or a failed vision? The truth lies buried in silence, a Gothic mystery that still endures. If the Dome of Saint-Denis had endured, Gothic cathedrals might have looked very different. Imagine Notre Dame or Chartres crowned not with spires but with vast domes, rounded heavens more like Byzantium than France. The skyline of Europe itself might have changed. But history turned on failure. The cupola cracked, shifted, and was lost. In its place, builders embraced something lighter, more flexible: ribbed vaults and pointed arches. These innovations carried Gothic architecture higher than any dome could. The failure of the dome forced a breakthrough. Gothic identity crystallized, not in circular crowns but in vertical light, in walls of stained glass, in spires piercing the heavens. The ribbed vault became the true symbol of the age. From Notre Dame to Chartres, from Reims to Amiens, Europe's greatest cathedrals rose, not because the dome succeeded, but because it failed. This is not just a tale of architecture, it's a story of how absence shapes history as powerfully as presence. The lost Dome of Saint-Denis did not simply vanish. Its failure redirected the entire course of European design. The vanished cupola stands as more than a collapse. It was a turning point, a spark that pushed builders toward ribbed vaults, pointed arches, and soaring spires. A moment when Europe chose light over weight, height over curve, vision over ruin. Saint-Denis is a place of paradox, the birthplace of Gothic glory, yet also the grave of its boldest experiment. Within its stones lies both triumph and loss. The lost dome reminds us that history is not written only by successes, but by failures that cleared the path for greatness. From its absence, the Gothic age was born. Let us pause and imagine an alternate history of medieval Europe. What if the Gothic cathedrals we know so well had not reached for the sky with spires, but instead embraced the vastness of domes? Picture Notre Dame, not with its iconic towers, but crowned with a monumental dome rising over Paris. The city skyline transformed into something closer to Byzantium than Gothic. Imagine Chartres Cathedral shimmering beneath a rounded crown of stone, echoing the grandeur of Byzantine architecture, a sacred union of East and West. This lost possibility reminds us that history could have looked entirely different. A single architectural choice had the power to change the skyline of Europe forever. What if domes, not spires, had triumphed? If the Dome of Saint-Denis had survived, the story of Gothic architecture might look completely different. Instead of soaring spires, France's cathedrals could have been crowned with domes, reshaping the skyline of medieval Europe. Picture Notre Dame or Chartres, not as we know them today, but resembling the great Byzantine domes. Vast crowns of stone echoing Hagia Sophia's brilliance, rising above the heart of France. In this alternate history, East and West might have blended seamlessly. Byzantine light and Gothic stone could have merged into a single unified style across Europe. But history chose another path. The dome collapsed, and instead of domes, towers, and spires defined the Gothic age. A fragile failure shaped the skyline of Europe forever. In England, Westminster Abbey became a masterpiece of vertical light. In Germany, Cologne Cathedral rose like a forest of stone, stretching beyond imagination. But history chose another path. The dream of the dome at Saint-Denis collapsed, yet out of failure came a new vision: the rise of the Gothic. From France, the Gothic spread across Europe, soaring higher and higher. Cathedrals reached not for domes, but for towers and spires that pierced the sky. The failure of one dome shaped the skyline of an entire continent. Gothic towers and endless vaults became Europe's signature, born not from triumph, but from collapse. And yet the dome never truly vanished. Though it collapsed at Saint-Denis, the idea lingered in Europe's imagination, waiting to be reborn. Centuries later, Florence dared the impossible. Brunelleschi crowned the city with his magnificent dome, an engineering marvel that defined the Renaissance. Soon after, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome rose to the heavens, crowned with Michelangelo's colossal dome, uniting faith and power in stone. These were no longer medieval experiments. They were Renaissance triumphs, blending mathematics, art, and ambition in a way the Middle Ages never achieved. The dome returned, but in a new age. Its failure shaped the Gothic. Its rebirth crowned the Renaissance. Two worlds divided by time, forever linked by stone. In this sense, the Abbey of Saint-Denis was centuries ahead of its time. Abbot Suger's daring plan for a monumental dome in the 12th century was more than just architecture. It was a vision of what Europe might become. But the world of medieval engineering wasn't yet ready. The tools, the techniques, the mastery of stone, it all fell short. The dome collapsed, and history took another course. Yet that failure was not in vain. Suger's dream foreshadowed the domes of the Renaissance. When Brunelleschi crowned Florence with his masterpiece, and Michelangelo raised the dome of St. Peter's in Rome, they fulfilled a vision first imagined at Saint-Denis. What collapsed in the 1100s rose again centuries later, in stone and glory. When the Great Fire of 2019 engulfed Notre Dame Cathedral, the world held its breath. In a single night, centuries of artistry, faith, and history came close to vanishing. This disaster reminded us of one undeniable truth. Our greatest monuments, no matter how grand, are fragile. They carry the weight of time, yet in moments they can be reduced to ashes. This was not the first time history witnessed such loss. Centuries earlier, the Grand Dome of Saint-Denis, the first Gothic cathedral, vanished. Once a daring vision of architecture, it disappeared into the past, leaving behind only drawings, fragments, and unanswered questions. Just like Notre Dame, its absence became as meaningful as its presence. When monuments fall, we are forced to ask, what does history preserve and what does it forget? Notre Dame's fire, like the vanished Dome of Saint-Denis, reminds us that memory is fragile. Yet in that fragility lies meaning. What disappears can shape us just as much as what survives, because every loss becomes part of the story of civilization. Historians today are still haunted by the vanished Dome of Saint-Denis. They search manuscripts, study medieval drawings, and examine fragments of stone to bring it back to life. But the truth is, no image has survived of what it really looked like. It remains a puzzle, a missing chapter in the story of Gothic architecture. The lost Cupola of Saint-Denis is more than an architectural detail. It was one of the boldest experiments of the Middle Ages, a daring attempt to crown the first Gothic cathedral with a dome. But the vision collapsed, vanishing from history, and leaving only fragments and faded records to tell its story. Its disappearance reminds us that history is full of roads not taken. Imagine if the Gothic world had embraced domes instead of spires. Cathedrals across Europe might look completely different today. The failed Dome of Saint-Denis shows us that sometimes what disappears shapes the future, just as much as what survives. Every failed experiment leaves a hidden legacy. The Cupola of Saint-Denis did not survive, but its ambition sparked new ideas that would echo centuries later in the domes of Florence, Rome, and beyond. In the end, the lost dome is not just a ruin. It is a reminder that history is written as much by failures as by triumphs. By telling the story of the lost Dome of Saint-Denis, we restore a missing piece of the Gothic puzzle. History is never complete. It is full of gaps, fragments, and silences. Every cathedral we admire today is built not only on stone, but also on forgotten experiments that shaped the path forward. Behind every triumph in architecture stands a trail of failures. The Dome of Saint-Denis collapsed, yet its failure opened the door for something greater. By daring to try, medieval builders pushed the limits of design and imagination, leaving behind lessons that would guide the Gothic masters. Without Saint-Denis, there might be no Chartres, no Reims, no Cologne. Each masterpiece of Gothic architecture owes something to the risks taken before it. The lost dome reminds us that failure is not the end of the story. It is the foundation upon which greatness is built. The Saint-Denis lost dome represents ambition, fragility, and transformation in the 12th century Gothic cathedral. Despite its groundbreaking design, it failed, leaving only silence where the stone once stood. This story, obscured by centuries, is often forgotten. No images survive, only fragments and memory. Yet the lost dome reveals the risks medieval builders were willing to take, pushing architecture beyond the limits of their age. It reminds us that even failure leaves a mark on history. To understand the Gothic age, we must also remember what was lost. The vanished Dome of Saint-Denis stands as a lesson. Ambition carries risk, fragility shapes memory, and transformation is born from failure. In its absence, we see not just what was destroyed, but what made the Gothic world possible. In the decades after Saint-Denis, Gothic builders searched for new ways to reach heavenward. The dream of a dome had failed, but the ambition for height remained. Architects needed a solution, something lighter, stronger, and more daring than ever before. The answer came in the form of the ribbed vault, a framework of intersecting stone ribs that carried the weight of the ceiling. Instead of relying on solid walls, these ribs directed the force downward, freeing the structure from the heavy burdens of earlier designs. This breakthrough transformed architecture. With the weight carried by ribs, walls no longer needed to be massive blocks of stone. Instead, they could be opened, filled with vast windows of stained glass. Light poured in, and Gothic cathedrals became not fortresses of stone but radiant temples of light. In the decades after the Abbey of Saint-Denis, medieval builders searched for a way to reach greater heights without relying on heavy domes. Their answer was the ribbed vault, a revolutionary framework of intersecting stone ribs. This design carried the weight of the ceiling, while freeing the walls to be thinner, taller, and filled with glass. The ribbed vault was more than just an engineering solution, it was a work of art. With its skeletal arms stretching overhead, cathedrals gained rhythm, balance, and order. Sunlight poured through brilliant stained glass, transforming dark interiors into shimmering mosaics of color and spiritual light. The dome had failed in the Gothic age, but the rib vault triumphed. From Paris to Canterbury, this architectural innovation spread across Europe, shaping the soaring cathedrals we admire today. The ribbed vault became the very symbol of Gothic architecture, blending strength, elegance, and divine illumination. Yet the lost dome of Saint-Denis lingered only in memory, often omitted from chronicles as if history itself wished to forget it. Across medieval Europe, masons attempted to build domes, but none matched the bold ambition of Abbot Suger. To understand Suger's vision, we must look east, to Byzantium. In Constantinople, the magnificent Hagia Sophia rose with a floating dome of light, a masterpiece that seemed to defy gravity. It became a beacon of possibility for the Gothic age. But unlike the Byzantines, Western builders lacked the techniques to make domes stand. The dream of Saint-Denis collapsed, leaving only fragments of ambition. From that failure, Gothic builders turned instead to the ribbed vault, a design that would transform Europe forever. The Byzantines had mastered the art of domes, but their building secrets never crossed westward. At Saint-Denis, we see a culture eager to imitate the brilliance of Constantinople, yet unable to replicate it. Had Byzantine engineers worked in Paris, perhaps history would read differently. But knowledge is fragile. Empires fall, methods vanish, and Europe was forced to rediscover what Rome and Constantinople had long perfected. The Dome of Saint-Denis became a bridge that collapsed midway, an unfinished link between the ancient world and the Gothic future. Only fragments remain, but its failure shaped the triumph of ribbed vaults and the rise of Gothic cathedrals. Paradoxically, without the failed Dome of Saint-Denis, the rib vault might never have been perfected. What seemed like loss became the spark for a new architectural triumph that defined the Gothic age. Abbot Suger's guiding vision was always light. He believed light was a pathway to God, meant to pour through his dome. When the dome fell, the rib vault carried that mission forward in a different way. Instead of just one magnificent dome, Gothic churches effortlessly displayed expansive walls of crystal glass. Rippled vaults consistently raised the ceilings ever higher, while elaborate stained glass windows ingeniously transformed solid stone walls into absolutely glowing narratives, erecting cathedrals into magnificent luminous entrances into the divine realm. The quest for light never came to an end. It merely moved in a different direction. Ancient Gothic cathedrals evolved into solid rock structures, rising even higher and more radiant than ever before. Picture Chartres, bathed in the vibrant shade of sapphire blue, or perhaps consider Sainte-Chapelle, where the walls seem to merge into dazzling panes of crystal glass. These remarkable artistic creations were directly influenced by Abbot Suger's magnificent vision, even though he did not possess the necessary dome to fully execute his grand plan. History often overlooks moments of significant change born from failure. The iconic lost dome of Saint-Denis, although barely mentioned in historical accounts, undoubtedly played a crucial role in the growth of one of Europe's greatest architectural revolutions, the splendid triumph of the Gothic style. Presently, scholars engage in digital archaeology to recreate the long-lost dome of Saint-Denis, employing detailed 3D models as powerful reminders that history is indeed a dynamic and ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation. However, no mathematical model can effectively depict the uncertain nature of medieval stone under pressure. Craftsmen had to face the reality. Arches might give way, and walls could crumble without any prior notice. The dome's eventual failsafe etched lasting lessons into the intricate Gothic cathedrals of Europe. Every ornate rib vault, every soaring majestic nave, bears within it the ghostly reminder of Saint-Denis, a poignant testament that innovation often prevails when faced with collapse and adversity. Reconstruction highlights not only what was of significant value, but also what might have been. Analyzing the lost dome of Saint-Denis is an action that fosters imagination, a testament to the fact that even ruins can generate visionary ideas. Failure is not the ultimate destination. It is merely a transitional phase. Gothic architecture, remarkably, flourished precisely because the iconic dome experienced a collapse, compelling skilled architects to venture into novel approaches and innovations. In innovation and in the realm of architecture, it is always born from a moment of collapse and a renewed sense of hope. The devastation of the dome provided a catalyst for the emergence of rib vaults and awe-inspiring glass cathedrals, effectively filling Europe with an abundance of light and creating transformative spaces. The lesson of Saint-Denis extends beyond the realm of architecture. Human advancement is consistently built upon the foundation of risk, exposure, and dynamic reinvention. What initially falls may ultimately provide the opening necessary for the emergence of what soars above. Consider the remarkable 2019 fire of Notre Dame, an irrefutable moment of devastation that promptly ignited a global outpouring of renewal. In a similar vein, the unfortunate Abbot Suger's disastrous dome effectively birthed the awe-inspiring splendor of the magnificent Gothic cathedrals that we know and cherish today. Failure and loss are not the end of history. They are its driving force. From fallen domes to radiant cathedrals, collapse and renewal have always built the path forward. We often forget the dome of Saint-Denis. History remembers triumphs, not failures, but even absence shapes the story. The Gothic age, with its soaring cathedrals and ribbed vaults, was born from Suger's fallen dome. To recall this lost cupola is to see how failure itself helped shape civilization. The lost dome of Saint-Denis is more than an architectural story. It is a human one, a tale of ambition, risk, loss, and rebirth. Abbot Suger's dome collapsed, but his dream of light survived, rising again in every Gothic cathedral, carried by ribbed vaults and stained glass. History hides truths in shadows, yet absence can shape the present. The cupola rose, fell, and vanished. But in vanishing, it gave birth to the eternal light of the Gothic age. The lost dome of Saint-Denis remains one of history's great mysteries. From its failure came ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and stained glass, the very elements that defined Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame and Chartres. It reminds us that even collapse can spark creation. History is written not only by triumphs, but by failures that light the way forward. If you'd like to uncover more hidden stories of the past, Subscribe to Obscured History and join the journey.